So Duncan Barrett, thank you ever so much for joining me today. It's really great to actually see you in person because we've been chatting over email, so it's nice to see you. How are you
Put a
doing?
face to the name.
Yeah.
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. You know, up and down like everyone, I think, in lockdown, but yeah.
Yeah.
Managing just about. I feel quite lucky. My whole family, we moved out of London about 7 or 8 months ago, and I think you know, we were umming and ahhing about it, and it was definitely turned out to be the right decision for this
Oh
whole experience.
gosh.
You know,
Yeah, that
yeah,
just
because it
sounds,
means
yeah.
we can get out. And,
Well, that's good. That's good. And you're the best-selling author of Hitler's British Isles. And today we're going to talk a little bit about. Well, we're going to go back to the Second World War, aren't we? And we're going to talk about how there was one area of the British Isles that was actually occupied. So I just want to say that obviously we have lots of counterfactual histories and TV programs. I think there was one out a couple of years ago which kind of explore the question of what would it have been like under Nazi control in Britain. But actually this was a place where that actually happened. So I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about how it happened and what life was like for people there, and then also how it came to an end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Channel Islands story, I think, is fascinating because, to me, I'd written several books about the home front in Britain and kind of ordinary people's experiences of war. And I think you get a strong sense of that there. They did have all the kind of challenges of making do and mending and so on, but they also had this element of living with the enemy and kind of getting to know them. So I feel there's sort of almost nowhere where civilians had a more extraordinary wartime experience in a way. The Channel Islands came to be occupied by the Germans because in June of 1940, shortly after Dunkirk, basically there was a meeting of the War Cabinet in London, and Churchill, who was fairly new in the job, was presented by his War Cabinet with this very unappealing proposition, which was basically that the Germans had pretty much overrun the coast of France. You know, they had France now. Everyone knew or expected at least that the next step was they were going to cross the channel and invade. And basically what the War Cabinet said to him was, the Channel Islands have been British territories since the time of William the Conqueror, but they are much closer to the coast of France than they are to the coast of Britain. They're going to be extremely easy for the Germans to take. We have these several thousand troops stationed there, but we think we should withdraw them. We should remove all our kind of military resources from the islands, and we should basically just let the Germans have them, because to fight over these islands now is going to be a waste of resources, a waste of men. And Churchill was furious. You can go, I went to the archives at Kew and read the minutes of the meeting, and it says the Prime Minister expressed the view it was repugnant to give up the islands without a fight. And I sort of couldn't help thinking, is that someone putting a sort of acceptable gloss on it? Because you can kind of imagine the explosive reaction this got from him. But ultimately, he kind of was forced to concede that as much as he didn't like the idea of walking away from a fight, they had much bigger fish to fry. They were worried about a potential invasion, which the Germans were indeed planning. And these small islands, they had a population of little under 100,000 British subjects, were not really worth losing the war over.
So they actually made the decision then to let them, you know, expose them to the threat that was happening in France and then further afield. So it's kind of extraordinary. Do we have any sense of what the reaction was like on mainland to this?
Well, on the mainland, they were quite keen throughout the war, and this was something that created tension with the Channel Islanders. Basically, once the decision had been taken, they did allow them a period. I mean, first of all, they removed the troops. The word went out. They had this meeting. The word went out the very same day to the islands. The troops started packing up that night and early the following morning, to the extent that many of them apparently left their breakfasts half-eaten behind them as they rushed to get onto these boats to get away. But they also allowed, particularly people with children, to evacuate their children. Mothers with children generally, often the fathers would stay behind, and that happened very quickly as well. And then after that, there was a period of about a week or so of kind of voluntary evacuation for people who wanted to leave. So they did at least make that possibility was on the table, if you know what I mean. If you didn't want to stick around and deal with Germans living in your spare room, you could head over to the mainland. But the problem was a lot of people didn't know anyone on the mainland. Some people had never even been to the mainland. You know, they would basically be living as refugees, living on handouts, you know, needing food, needing money, needing jobs and so on. So it wasn't necessarily a very appealing prospect either. And then what happened as the war went on, Churchill, having very reluctantly given up these islands, they were a bit of a thorn in his side. I think he saw them as a bit of, I mean, they were kind of a chink in the rhetoric of, you know, we'll fight them on the beaches. Well, they didn't. They just, you know, they left the beaches and let them walk right in. So Churchill almost didn't want reminding of it, to the extent that the BBC were actually prevented from broadcasting about the islands. There were calls in Parliament of people sort of saying, you know, let's put something out, because they knew the islanders were still listening to the BBC legally at first, and then when the Germans forbade it, illegally on various hidden radios. And so they were sort of saying, you know, let's put out a broadcast saying we haven't forgotten you, you know, we're thinking of you. And the message always came down, no, we don't talk about it, we don't want to bring up that subject, it's bad for morale, you know, we don't want people dwelling on the fact that there are British subjects living under German rule. Let's just basically forget all about it and deal with it at the end of the war when the time comes.
Goodness me. And so for the people that were left on these islands then, what was life like for them?
Well, it was, they called it the model occupation. The Attorney General in Guernsey coined this phrase, the model occupation, by which he meant the aspiration, at least, was that compared to, say, the occupation in France, compared to other German occupations in Europe, this would be as kind of soft an occupation as possible. And certainly the Germans who arrived were quite willing to go along with that to some extent. They tended to not want to rock the boat. They wanted it to be as positive an experience as it could be, partly because they'd formed this idea. They were still intending to invade and occupy the mainland at one point, and they had this idea that it would be a kind of propaganda coup, basically, if they could say, look, 70,000, which was the number who stayed, who didn't evacuate, 70,000 British people have been living under German rule for however many years. There have been no executions in the streets. There have been no abuses of power. It's actually not as bad as maybe you think. And what they thought was that then, if that invasion came to pass, it would limit resistance on the mainland, because people would start saying, well, you know, so-and-so's cousin over in Guernsey, you know, seemed to be all right with the Germans being there. That was their goal anyway. And for the local leaders, it made sense, because the fact is, the troops had been withdrawn, the decision had been taken not to defend the islands. Really, they saw their job as protecting their people as best they could. And in a way, the best way for them to do that was to try to form a kind of functional working relationship with the Germans, because they sort of, you know, both systems of leadership were kind of going on side by side. So you had the kind of local civilian leaders, you know, the kind of elected representatives there, basically responsible for their own people. Then you had the Germans kind of in charge above them. But to some extent, some of them would kind of work against each other a little more. In Jersey, there was a rather wily former lawyer there who was the bailiff, the kind of head of the government in Jersey, effectively. And he was quite good at sort of working with the Germans, but just sort of sticking the knife in now and then, or kind of subverting their plans now and then when he could. Right. In Guernsey, the guy in charge, Ambrose Sherwell, maybe not such a kind of wily political operator. He was much more kind of doing his best to ingratiate himself, doing his best to kind of get on well with them, to the extent that Churchill, from some of the things that were coming out of Guernsey, started to think, actually, this guy has effectively turned. He's basically a quisling, you know, because he would go so far to try to ingratiate himself. He would often kind of cross unspoken lines and sort of feed into the German propaganda that they were fostering. He was almost kind of bolstering that without intending to.
Oh, okay, I see. And you mentioned that obviously there was a propaganda campaign going on to exclude the Channel Islands from the narrative of how Britain was doing in the war. But in terms of communication, was there any communication between the mainland and the islands? Were people able to, exchange letters, for example? Was there anything going on?
You could send these Red Cross messages, which was the same throughout occupied Europe. This scheme of the Red Cross organised this massive network where they would take over a sort of a prominent central location. So in Guernsey or Jersey, it might be a shop in the town square or whatever, and they would have people there, and you could go in, you'd get a certain kind of allocation, and every so often you'd be allocated, you know, your name would come up in the paper or whatever, or up on the board in the window, and you would be allowed to go and send these 25 words messages. They were censored both kind of locally and then by the Germans. I spoke to a woman actually whose job was to type up the messages and then take them to the Kommandantur and kind of hand them over to the Germans. And she always viewed this with kind of dread, mainly because, and this was the case with many young women at the time, of all the kind of flirtatious comments she would get, kind of going right into the heart of German territory. She, you know, all these Germans were kind of trying to, you know, I was going to say get her number, but you know, find out who she was and where she, you know, how they could get in touch with her and so on. So it's kind of running the gauntlet in a sense, going through that. But so you would have this limited communication, but it was heavily censored. It was only really supposed to talk about personal matters. You know, you weren't meant to be telling someone in mainland Britain anything militarily significant or any kind of information that might be useful to the war. But people did get out information that was meant to be secret. So, for example, a lot of them have references to Mother Hubbard, which they thought the Germans wouldn't recognise, as indicating that food stores were getting low and they were struggling for food. One guy I spoke to actually was very inventive with the Red Cross messages. He was a kind of pretty much dog's body. He was the lowest of the low in this small insurance company that was a branch of a big national insurance company. And everyone else in his office evacuated, which meant that he, as the kind of office boy, ended up basically in charge. He had no idea how to run this place, but he realised that the kind of head office was based at a residential address in England, and as far as the German censors would be concerned, they wouldn't know it was a business premises. So he started this communication with the kind of the boss, basically, of his insurance company, claiming that it was his uncle, and he would send they'd send these coded messages back and forth, basically, in order that he could find out you know, what on earth do I do? How do I run this business? But it had to develop this real, you know, sort of elaborate kind of system of subtext, basically, to get these questions and answers going back and forth without the Germans realizing that these weren't just two family members communicating.
But then that must be really difficult for you as a researcher as well, when you're looking through these archival documents to try and figure out, is that, you know, is that a message or is that just a word that they're using? I mean, you must have had some of that.
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest, this book, my book is based largely, I did look at some archival material, but really I'm interested in the kind of ordinary people's stories. All of my books really are based primarily on interviews. So I went out to, I moved my whole family over to Guernsey for about 3 months in the summer of 2016. And then I was kind of island hopping around and interviewing as many people as I could find. So I spoke to about 100 odd people. So in a way, I was getting the stories from the horse's mouth, if you know what I mean, primarily. So that example, actually, that guy was a guy I interviewed, and he told me this whole story about how he managed to do that. I don't know whether I'd have picked it up if I'd just been going through, I mean, I did look through, you know, piles and piles of these Red Cross messages, but the vast majority of them are pretty boring. They're, you know, I don't know, it's been a sunny week, you know, I don't know, something about the crops are not doing great in the garden, so and so broke his foot. Do you know what I mean? They're short. They're basically postcards, and there are, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So you can understand why stuff might slip through now and then. The Germans probably weren't reading them all that carefully, you know, as long as they seemed innocent enough.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so how did this come to a close then? How did they, you know, how did the Germans leave the Channel Islands?
Well, it came to a close. Interestingly, they celebrate Liberation Day as the big kind of festival, their huge national holiday. It should have been on VE Day. On VE Day, Churchill made his famous broadcast, and he announced our dear Channel Islands are also to be freed to be freed today. This was kind of almost the first time he'd spoken about them since the start of the war, essentially. But now they were our dear Channel Islands. And one woman I spoke to said she was listening to that broadcast on her secret illegal radio in the attic, and she said, I turned to my sister and I said, oh, dear Channel Islands, he couldn't care less if we'd all died. So that kind of gives you a flavour of the feeling towards, particularly towards Churchill, which was a bit unfair, because actually he had not wanted to you know, abandon the islands at all. He'd kind of been sort of pressurized into it by his colleagues in the war cabinet. But there was a kind of element of resentment, because when D-Day happened, the islanders could see, they knew this invasion was coming. They could see the invasion happening in the coast of France. They could see the fires. They could smell the fires in some cases. They could hear the kind of exchange of fire. And most people had assumed they would be liberated then, because obviously if you're going from England to France, you go right past the Channel Islands. In fact, the decision had been taken not to. And again, this kind of led to this feeling that they'd sort of been forgotten. So many people told me that was almost the hardest period of the occupation, was that realization, oh, we've been forgotten again, we've been abandoned again, almost. People were ready. One man told me his father had an old rifle stashed in the cellar. He was getting out because he thought the troops were arriving and he was going to get out in the streets and fight with them. But in fact, it was Eisenhower who had said, basically, there's no way we're going into fight for these small islands that are not militarily significant, where many civilians will end up being killed in the crossfire. We're just going to wait, basically starve them out, essentially, because once they're cut off, they've got no food supplies coming in from mainland Europe. And as indeed happened, both the locals, first of all, began starving. Fortunately, they were helped by the Red Cross, who brought in parcels, and then the Germans began starving. And I think any other leader in some ways would probably have capitulated by that point and kind of turned the Germans over. But unfortunately, after D-Day, having had these quite moderate commandants all the way through the occupation, on D-Day, a man called Hofmeier, an admiral in the Kriegsmarine, happened to be caught out basically by the D-Day invasion and sort of retreated to the Channel Islands, essentially, rather than, because he couldn't get to anywhere safe other than that, and managed to take over the kind of whole business there. And he was, unlike the previous commandants, a complete fanatical Nazi. He said to the bailiff of Jersey, when this is over, it'll be just the two of us left and we'll both be eating the grass. That was his kind of view, was, never surrender. And so unfortunately what happened was, on VE Day, when the British troops did arrive, they came within, or just to the edge of the kind of territorial waters of Guernsey and Jersey. And Hofmeier sent out a boat to say to them, basically, if they crossed that territory before midnight, even though Hitler was dead, Germany had surrendered, the war was over, if they crossed that line before midnight, he would fire on their ships. And the head of the Liberation Forces was absolutely incensed. He sent a message back saying, if you dare do any such thing, I will personally see you hanged tomorrow in the marketplace. But at the same time, they knew this was a real, diehard, fanatical Nazi in charge. They didn't really know what he was capable of. So the ships withdrew. So they didn't get liberated on VE Day, as was the plan. They got liberated the following day, which was the 9th of May. So that's their Liberation Day, which they celebrate even to this day. Sadly, not as with all kind of festivals here, they're under lockdown as well, so they've not been having the parades and the street parties and so on that they normally do. But they've been celebrating it, I think, as kind of best they can over there, just as we've been marking VE Day in our own way here.
And it sounds like it was a real trauma, not just the occupation, but the feeling of neglect. And I wonder what the long-term consequences of that have been. Was there a lot of resentment that stayed there?
I think there was, certainly in the years immediately after the war. I mean, the other unfortunate thing that happened pretty much immediately after the war and after liberation was the Home Secretary was sent out, and he made this remark. Basically, there was a kind of limited amount of information coming out of the Channel Islands. I mean, the British would send reconnaissance teams in. They never tried to invade the islands. Hitler was always convinced the British were going to invade the islands and try and take them back, because he saw them as this great prize that he'd captured. They never did try to do that, but they did send teams of commandos in to kind of, they called them nuisance raids, to kind of cause a bit of trouble here and there. They sent spies undercover to try and do reconnaissance, find out what the kind of, how many planes were at the airfield, because these were planes that were being used, in the Battle of Britain and in the Blitz and so on. They were kind of, active in the war, if you know what I mean. The Channel Islands were being used against the mainland to that extent. And so, and there was also this slight worry that some of the island leaders maybe weren't behaving the way they'd been expected to. So this kind of suspicion that had come up around Ambrose Sherwell, the Attorney General of Guernsey, I think slightly unfairly, insofar as I think he was he was bumbling rather. He made some very bad decisions, but I don't think there was nothing sinister about it, if you know what I mean. But I think Churchill kind of completely wrote him off. And then, of course, there were local women having affairs with German men, relatively common, although even today something that people don't generally want to talk about. There were kind of all sorts of small compromises here and there that were being made. And so I think for those on the mainland, it was difficult to really understand the sort of day-to-day compromises and the kind of ambiguity of the situation they'd been in. They hadn't had that ambiguity. The people on the mainland had a pretty black and white view of Germany throughout the war, understandably. The closest they came was when they were being bombed by them. The people in the Channel Islands sort of had to see things slightly differently because they saw the humanity of these men. They saw that most of them were not kind of fanatical Nazis. Most of them were kind of men with families back home that they talked about, and who in some cases formed quite good friendships with the locals that they were living alongside. So when the war came to an end, first of all, those who had evacuated came back, and there was a real issue there because they'd lived this very different war for 5 years, and in some cases within families, you might have some siblings evacuated, some siblings staying, and they'd had such different experiences. I think there was a degree of distrust on both sides. Those who'd stayed, those who'd reached the point of starvation in some cases, felt that those who'd evacuated had kind of jumped ship in a way just when things were getting difficult. Those who'd left felt that those who'd stayed had got a little bit too chummy in some ways with the Germans. They didn't have the kind of clean sort of moral slate, in a sense, as to their own conduct during the war. And unfortunately, when the Home Secretary arrived shortly after liberation, he made this remark, which I think was well intentioned. He said, don't worry, I brought enough whitewash with me to cover the islands. In other words, sort of basically saying, we're just going to kind of forget about anything questionable that happened here. But there was this sort of unspoken assumption, all of you who lived through this very difficult experience did something wrong and something to be ashamed of. And, fortunately, we're not going to hold it against you. We're going to kind of pretend it never happened. And so I think, again, for the local people, there was this feeling of not only had they felt they were abandoned, once when the British troops left in the first place, again, when the British troops failed to materialise when they were invading France, then when a kind of representative did turn up, he basically was implying that they had something that they had to be ashamed of, in a sense. And I think that kind of worry has lingered ever since, to some degree, to the extent that even, me going there 70 odd years later, what seemed to me like quite innocent aspects of this kind of ambiguity, of this difficult situation people were thrown into, would put people in a real state of anxiety. I think for me, coming from the mainland, they're very anxious about being judged. So one woman, for example, was telling me about this German man who lived in the house next door, who had a daughter about this woman was 6 or 7, I think, at the time of the story she was telling. It was her 7th birthday, in fact. And anyway, she'd become quite friendly with this guy because he had a 7-year-old girl at home. And she had this autograph book, and she said some of the Germans living next door had written birthday wishes in her autograph book. And she got this book out, and then she was about to hand it to me, and then she stopped and she said, I don't want you to think I was a collaborator. And she was deadly serious that I would be, that literally she this terrible word to kind of invoke. And I sort of said, you were 7 years old. What are you talking about? Do you know what I mean? I'm not, and in any case, I'm not really here to judge. I mean, and obviously there are people who did things that were worthy of being judged, but the majority, I think, were, really just trying to get on with their lives, trying to protect their families, trying to kind of get through it all and do as they've been told, which was basically wait it out, don't get involved in this war, we'll fight the war, you just sit there and wait, and we'll be back at the end when we've won it all, essentially. And that's what people, for the most part, were trying to do. But even now there's this kind of residual anxiety, did we do something wrong? Did we cross some kind of line? One guy told me a German asked him for directions, and he gave him directions. Then immediately he thought, should I have sent him the wrong way? Is my kind of duty to interfere as much as possible? And have I done something unpatriotic by telling him where the, local post office is, or whatever it is? I mean, but these kind of, for most people, quite minor, quite trivial, small dilemmas really were a massive part of life for 5 years.
Goodness me, those stories, I mean, it's easy to look at history as a huge sweep of events that happens, and you don't really think about the individuals involved, but actually these oral histories that you've uncovered give a really important message, I think, and especially at the moment when we have been, you know, commemorating V-Day and thinking about the war and things, and when you see lots of programs like films like The Darkest Hour and things on at the cinema, you don't tend to think so much about these smaller stories. So it's been a real pleasure to hear a little bit more about that. What's next for you?
What's next? I am, well, unfortunately, lockdown has slightly stalled the project I was in the middle of, which is the first one of these books that I worked on was actually not a World War II. Mainly I've done kind of World War II topics, but my partner Nuala and I wrote a book called The Sugar Girls, which was about factory workers for Tate and Lyle in the East End of London. That was back in 2012, that book came out, and we worked on various things both together and separately, generally the same kind of thing, basically interviewing people with a shared experience, and then you know, writing a book that tells their kind of personal stories alongside the social history of the time. But we were right in the midst of doing effectively a sequel to that one, which was because our publishers kept saying, you know, can't you do more Sugar Girls? Can't you do more Sugar Girls? Like, I don't know. And we came up with the idea of doing one about the original Tate factory in Liverpool, which in some ways has interesting parallels to the London East End factories. And we kind of almost got to the end of all our research and so on and ready to start writing. And we had one last trip planned to go up to Liverpool to kind of, you know, gather the last of the material we needed. And then literally the day before that trip was when the whole country went into lockdown. So we're kind of stuck. I know. So we're like that close to finishing the research for this book and being able to get on and write it. But it will get there. We'll get there sooner or later. Yeah.
Something for people to look forward to, and in the meantime they can catch up by reading the first one, the Sugar Girl.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Duncan, thank you for your time today.
That's all right. My pleasure.
Thank you.